The Illuminate are finally here in Helldivers 2, trying to destroy the very fabric of our managed democracy. They bring with them a lot of dangerous new enemies and tactics that we Helldivers have never had to deal with before. And this shakeup really affects the usefulness of our weapons, in particular our primary weapons, which we want to be trusty and reliable as the main weapons we will be wielding versus these squids. And so that begs the question, which of these primary weapons are the best and which are the worst to take on versus the Illuminate? Dr. Buplov here, and that's what I hope to find out. In this video, I will test all of the primary weapons versus the squids and rank them on a tier list, with S being the best and Poop Hater being the worst. Starting with the AR-23 Liberator, which is the base gun in this game, a highly accurate assault rifle with a fast fire rate and decent recoil. And versus the squids, this is quite good. Versus the voteless horde, this does a good job of mowing them down. Assault rifles in general are going to be better on the Illuminate front because of all the voteless that are out there, as well as with how shields get taken down. So the Liberator does good versus the voteless, but it also does decently versus the Overseers, who are a bit tankier. Now this gun is light armor penetrating, so it will not pierce the Overseers' helmets, but will be able to do fairly decently taking them out from the body. And it also does decent work at blowing the jetpacks off the elevated Overseers as well. The nice accuracy and good handling will make quick work of the Watchers as well, taking them out super fast. Now this is not going to be that great versus the Harvesters. It takes nearly a whole mag to take down its shield, and you are pretty much limited to try to take them out from the eye, which is very inefficient and not something I would even recommend at all. Regardless, this feels pretty good and feels like it has a very solid footing on this front. And to be honest, I was actually going to give this an A at first, but given that there are some things coming up that really outshine this, I think this actually needs to go in as a high B instead versus the squids. But now we have the AR-23P Liberator Penetrator, which is a medium armor penetrating variant of the base Liberator with the trade-off of having a little bit less damage per bullet. And versus the squids, I will say this feels pretty great. It takes down the voteless horde very well, and it deals with the Watchers nicely. For the Overseers, it has the ability to take them out from the body or from the head with its medium armor penetration. This will take nearly a full mag to take shields off the Harvesters, but this actually has the advantage of being able to actually take these big boys down by shooting them in their medium armor leg joints. For all of this, I find this to be a very solid pick, and so I will be giving it an A for the Illuminate. But next we have the AR-23C Liberator Concussive, another variant of the base Liberator, but this time with a slower fire rate, compensated for with a drum magazine and concussive rounds that stagger the enemies backwards. And versus the squids, I'm honestly just not a huge fan. The concussive shots can be good at staggering the voteless horde, and perhaps most impactfully, these will stagger the Overseers decently well, but the bullets feel like they aren't damaging these guys nearly enough. And it's not like when facing off against the bugs, where the horde can feel so overwhelming that using this and pumping these concussive bullets will make you feel mostly untouchable. I find myself a little bit less at risk versus the Illuminate horde, as it seems just a little bit easier to run around without getting hurt. Generally, I find this to be just less impactful for multiple enemy management than I would like, and I would prefer something that just gets rid of them. That being said, the mag size being very high is nice and does allow you to pump bullets in for a decently long period of time, but it's just not really for me. Overall, with the good and the bad, I think this will end up getting more so a low B for me versus the Illuminate. But now we have the StA-52 assault rifle, which is a kill zone themed assault rifle that you actually have to buy from the superstore. There was some drama with this gun, especially because of the high price on it, which is more than half that of a war bond. But as a result of that drama, Arrowhead gave us two of the other Killzone guns for free. This gun does the same damage as the base Liberator, but it has a drum magazine, so it does have a lot more bullets in each mag, and it has a higher fire rate than the base Liberator with a slight trade-off of a little bit higher recoil. And well, to be honest, this feels like it was actually made to face off against the Illuminate. This thing mows down the voteless horde very well, and with its higher capacity, you can do so for much longer durations. I feel like this gun actually has the kind of capacity that most players, I think, wish all assault rifles had. And because of this capacity, I was even able to take out 2 tanky overseers in 1 mag. The main drawback, I think, is it does seem to struggle a little bit at range. The reticle is not one that's really made for ranged attacks, and it's kind of hard, at least for me, to use to aim. I think the handling also might be a little bit tad worse on this than the snappy base Liberator, which makes it a little bit harder to stay on target for things like the elevated overseers and the watchers. Ultimately though, this does feel pretty awesome to use, and I do think it really does outshine the Liberator, at least on the squid front, to the point where there are few situations I can think of where you would want to opt for that over this. Now, of course, I'm not a fan of how this was monetized, but from a purely gameplay perspective, it's very solid. So I will actually be giving this an A for the squids. But now let's move on to the AR-23A Liberator Carbine, which is yet another Liberator variant, but this time with a faster fire rate compensated for with a higher recoil. And I gotta be honest, I'm not really a fan of using this versus the squids. While yes, this can be a bit more effective versus a large amount of the voteless hordes when they are very close to you, this is going to be pretty rough at further away ranges, requiring a lot of pulse firing and first person shooting as well as crouching. This feels like a bit of a struggle to use versus the elevated overseers and the watchers who usually aren't in your face, although I can see it being decent versus the walking overseers that do get close. Honestly, I don't think the extra fire rate provides enough of an advantage at these closer ranges to warrant picking this over the base Liberator or even the StA-52. I have been hearing that a lot of people think this gun is solid, so I would be interested to know why people feel that way in the comments, but I'm just not a fan. I'm giving this a C versus the squids. But now we can move on from the Liberator family to the next assault rifle, the AR-61 Tenderizer. And this is a very accurate, high damage assault rifle with a longer reload pattern and less capacity. And versus the squids, this just feels okay. The damage, of course, is high, and that is very welcome, and the accuracy is nice on this thing, being able to take most things out fairly quickly. The main issue that I've found with this is the mag size, which can feel a bit small, and ultimately that can be a little bit frustrating. I just was getting frustrated having to constantly reload time and time again. It didn't feel as good as I was hoping it would. Overall, I will give it a B for the squids. But now we have the BR-14 Adjudicator, which is a high damage, medium armor penetrating assault rifle with a high recoil. And versus the squids, it does decently. The high damage will mow the enemies down, and the medium armor penetration will be good for the overseers' heads. Of course, the recoil can be a bit tough, and we still have a smaller capacity, so it's gonna have its struggles. It can be tempting to kind of use this in semi-auto mode for a little bit more ease of use, but I feel like with the voteless horde out there, you may want to default to full auto. This also has the ability to take out the harvester with its medium armor penetration, but again, the recoil just kind of makes it hard to pull off as nicely as something like the Liberator Penetrator. It does feel good at times, but it feels bad at times. Ultimately, I think this is going to get a B for the squids. Moving on to the marksman rifles, we have the R2124 Constitution, a slow firing antique marksman rifle with a high damage medium armor penetration and a very slow fire rate. And there's no other way to put this. This is just straight poop incarnate versus the squids. The slow fire rate means you won't be mowing down the voteless horde at all, and even the bigger enemies like the overseer and the watcher seem to take a ton of bullets, and it will take you a long time with the slow fire rate. And this thing shoots so slow that it can't even take down the shields even with a full mag being unloaded. I suppose, yeah, it can take out a harvester, but that's not going to be worth taking this with you at all. It just feels like you're playing with with your hands tied behind your back, don't use this. This is poop hater tier, no doubt. But next we have the R63 Diligence, which is a light armor penetrating marksman rifle with high damage and a decent fire rate. And versus the squids, I really actually like this. The damage on this feels great, and the fire rate is fast enough to actually do decently versus the horde. The damage ends up taking out the overseers pretty well as well, and I do like that it can wreck these otherwise tanky guys. Having good precision and handling also makes this do pretty well versus the watchers. I did think perhaps with this precision this would be decent versus the eyes of the harvesters, but yeah, it's just not worth it to go for the eyes at all. But at least this does take their shields down quickly. I like this, so I'm gonna give it an A for the Illuminate. But let's move on to the R63 CS Diligence Counter Sniper, which is a medium armor variation of the Diligence with more damage but a smaller capacity and a little bit worse handling. Versus the squids though, I like this a lot. Now it won't be the best for the voteless hordes as there is a smaller capacity, and this is just less of a horde clearing weapon, but the high damage still will take them out quickly. But one thing I really do like to do with this is take this with a jetpack and snipe from the rooftops in the city environments. Now if you're using this, you're probably going to want to go for more of the bigger enemies like the overseers, which this will make quick work of. Being able to dish out good body damage, but also being able to get them in the head. It also takes the jetpacks off the elevated overseers pretty nicely. Watchers as well are easy to take out with this, and it even does well versus the harvesters, being able to take off their shield as well as their shield generator pretty quickly, and also being able to kill them from their leg joints fairly nicely. Overall, this is solid, so I will be giving it an A for the squids. But now for the Plaz 39 Accelerator Rifle, which is another Killzone crossover weapon that's a plasma sniper rifle that fires these charged up bursts. And to be honest, this truly feels amazing for the squids. Now, as a sniper rifle, it won't be the best for the voteless horde, but as it is a burst fire, you are actually able to take out a couple with each burst, especially if you swipe your reticle horizontally as you fire. The charge up is a bit faster than other charge up weapons too, so that definitely helps when facing off against them. Another thing to know is, like all plasma weapons, you can hurt yourself, but you gotta be shooting yourself pretty close. Where this really starts to shine is with everyone else besides the voteless. This can one burst the watchers, it can even one burst the overseers, although it's not as consistent, and so reliably it's more so going to be two bursts. But this can also be a very good weapon for the harvesters as well, taking down their armor and sniping their shield generators, as well as taking them out from their joints. And similar to with the Diligence counter sniper, I like to jetpack around the city and find little sniper perches to take things out with this. Now, this could be a little bit of recency bias, but this feels very good, and it definitely feels a step up from the Diligence counter sniper that I gave an A to, so I'm gonna do it. This is an S tier for the squids. But now let's move on to the SMGs, and we have the MP98 Knight, and this is the most expensive gun in the game, requiring the Super Citizen edition of the game to own. Although I guess the StA-52 is giving it a little bit of a run for its money. Now this is a super fast firing SMG, which is one-handed, so you can use this with things like the ballistic shield and the directional shield, as well as while running away. And I actually like this quite a bit versus the squids. It's a bit weird to me because I did not like the carbine, but I do like this. Anyways, I think having slightly less recoil helps here, and versus the voteless horde, it seems like it takes them out very nicely. But what also gives this some points is that you're able to run while firing, which can be huge, as it allows you to stay mobile while these enemies are close. Pairing this with the shield also works pretty well, being able to defend yourself and allowing you to close the gaps on things like overseers and watchers. Really, you just need to make sure that you're pulse firing a lot here, especially at range. And I would also just make sure to have something more reliable to deal with the squids at range, because it's just not as good for that. Overall, I do think it's solid. I will be giving it a B for the squids. But now we have the StA-11 SMG, which is the third Killzone crossover weapon, and this is a high fire rate SMG with a pretty high capacity. In actuality though, this is pretty much a variant of the MP Knight with the same damage, but actually slightly less capacity and a slower fire rate with the trade-off of slightly better recoil. And well, for the squids, I don't like it. For one thing, I think the MP Knight is just better from the stats alone, but the handling on this is also quite a bit more difficult to deal with, making it harder to get on target. Even when running away and using the one-handed perk, I felt like it was quite a bit harder to get the enemies. There also is no scope on this, so you can't really see what you're shooting if you do decide to use the first person. Overall, I'm just not a fan here, and so I'm gonna give this a C for the squids. But now we have the SMG-32 Reprimand, which is an SMG sort of, but it's not one-handed, which is weird for an SMG. It has medium armor penetration and a decently high damage, and versus the squids, it actually does feel decent. The bullets mow down the voteless horde, and the medium armor penetration means you have more options for the overseers, and of course you can also use this to take the harvesters down as well. The recoil can be a bit tough to manage, and it also has that spread which hurts the damage as you go further and further at range. But one thing you can do is to change the fire mode to semi or burst to kind of help control the pattern. Honestly though, if you're able to just control your firing a bit in full auto mode by timing how long you're holding the trigger down, that can be a great way to variably be able to fire semi and burst and full auto whenever the situation calls for each. Ultimately, this feels okay, so I will give it a B for the squids. But now for the SMG-37 Defender, which is a one-handed SMG that otherwise has pretty similar stats to the base Liberator. And to be honest, if you like the base Liberator for the squids, you probably will like this even better. Beyond just having slightly higher damage, this also has the great benefits of the one-handed perk. So you can use this while running away and firing at the voteless horde. And you can make good use of things like the directional shield to help you close the gap and block some incoming fire. With the little bit more damage that this does, this feels pretty good taking out the overseers and the watchers, doing so a little bit better than the base Liberator. All in all, I find this to be a solid choice, and so yeah, this gets an A from me for the squids. Moving on, we have the SMG-72 Pummeler, which is another SMG and a bit of a defender variant, trading lower damage for bullets that stun. And people tend to hate this gun, but I gotta say, I actually really enjoyed using this versus the squids. The damage is less than the defender, yes, but the stuns can come in handy, especially rendering the overseers stunned, which you can single out to kind of render them useless for a while. The damage difference is there, but it isn't really that noticeable, so that's good. And of course, this shares the same one-handed benefits that really come in handy versus the horde. And I like that on the Illuminate front with these one-handed guns, you get more of the benefit of being able to run away and fire as well as using shields, whereas on the other two fronts, it's a little bit more one-sided, with the running away being more effective versus the bugs and the shields being more effective versus the bots. Anyways, yeah, this gets an A from me for the squids. But now let's move on to the shotguns, and we have the SG-8 Punisher, which is a high damage shotgun with light armor penetration, and this also feels very solid versus the squids. Each shot packs a big staggering punch which can hold the voteless horde back as well as stagger the overseers when you pump those shots into them. The high damage is very welcome too, being able to deal with enemies much quicker. This feels solid, so I will give it an A. But now we have the SG-8S Slugger, which is kind of a lower damaging Punisher variant that has medium armor penetration to compensate. And I gotta say, I really hate this for the squids. I don't know if it's the slug shots or the tight spread, but I find myself just missing so many more targets than I was with the Punisher. And while the medium armor damage can help with some things like the harvester, it's really not worth it. When the shots do hit, it feels good, but the lesser damage makes it not worth it. It's not total poop, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it. I will give it a C for the squids. Okay, so now for the SG-20 Halt, which is another Punisher variant that actually has two firing modes. Flechette for medium armor high damage and stun for very low damage but stun. And I gotta tell you, this is absolutely amazing versus the Illuminate. The stun rounds can be used to stun multiple voteless at once, getting them off your back, but also allowing you to finish them off with ease. A single stun round will also just stop overseers in their tracks, as well as the watchers for a while too. So you can do something like switch to your flechette rounds after stunning them to finish them off. And speaking of the flechette rounds, these feel really good too. The damage isn't as much as the Punisher, but it's still pretty high, so you can reliably take things out, especially because there is more spread on this thing than the Slugger. And it also has medium armor penetration, so that will be good and make it usable for things like the Harvesters. I find this to be a very strong gun to take with you versus these Illuminates, making it one of the best primary options available to you. Honestly, I gotta do it. I think this is an S tier for the squids. But now let's move on to the SG-451 Cookout, which is yet another Punisher variant, but this time shooting out phosphorus fire pellets, which cause enemies to take fire damage over time. And this one feels also very amazing versus the Illuminate. Because of the spread, you can fire upon multiple of the voteless horde at once, and the damage over time will take them out for you. All you really need to do is pepper a shot in on them and move on. This also seems to do fairly decently versus the Overseers, again with the incendiary damage over time helping you out, as well as some stagger. And this will even work pretty well against the Watchers, even from afar. This is another great one, and honestly it feels roughly the same as the Halt does, so I'm going to give it an S tier as well versus the squids. But now for the SG-225 Breaker Shotgun, which is a full auto shotgun with light armor penetration. And I think this does okay for the squids. The full auto on this is good, taking out the horde, and that feels pretty strong. The Watchers can also be taken out pretty quickly with this thing, but I am just not a huge fan of using this versus the Overseers, as it feels like you need to go through a lot of bullets in order to take them out, at least if you're not super close. I found myself often running out of ammo very quickly when going against these guys. I think it has some upsides, but it just doesn't feel like the best, and so I will be giving it a B for the squids. But now we have the SG-225 SP Breaker, Spray, and Pray for a shorter name, which is a breaker variant with lower damage but more spread. And I actually ended up liking this a bit more versus the Breaker when facing off against these squids. In part, it's because of the higher capacity, which allows me to take more of the voteless horde out in one mag, and that can be nice. This is still pretty weak for the Overseers and not feeling like it does a whole lot, so basically it just falls in a similar category for me. It's just a little bit better than the Breaker, so I will also give this a B. Next up is the SG-225 IE Breaker Incendiary, and this is another variant of the Breaker but with incendiary rounds and a burst pattern. And this is quite good, similar to the Cookout, having a good spread to take multiple enemies out at once. However, due to the less damage per shot, you end up needing to fire this a little bit more onto the targets. It also doesn't have the stagger like the Cookout does, so while it still feels pretty great, it's a little bit worse than that. For that, I will give it an A for the squids. But now for the CB9 Exploding Crossbow, which fires these explosive staggering shots, and just like with the other two factions, this is awesome for the squids. Of course, the explosions are very effective versus the voteless horde, being able to take out multiple of them at a time. And being one-handed means you have the benefits of firing this while running away, or using this with something like the directional shield, which if you do can even be used to fire a little bit close to yourself and still end up okay. One thing to note though is on the city streets, this tends to bounce a bit off the flat road, so you can end up missing your shots if you're not too careful. Versus the Overseers, this is pretty nice, being able to two-shot these beefy guys, and also it's able to one-shot the Watchers. But that's not all. This can also be used to blow up the spacecrafts by sending an explosion right into it, and it also can be a pretty decent option for the Harvesters as well, doing good damage versus their joints and explosive damage, so you don't need to be entirely spot on. So yeah, this is great. This is going to get an S tier for the squids. But now we have the Eruptor, which is basically an explosive sniper rifle which releases a bunch of shrapnel with each shot. And it does have some similarities to the crossbow, being able to hurt a lot of the horde with those explosions and having a lot of great damage, being able to do things like taking out the overseers quickly, as well as being one of the few primaries that can take out the spaceships. But I will say it is noticeably worse than the crossbow. It isn't one-handed, so it definitely doesn't have those benefits, but the fire rate is also much slower, as well as having really rough handling, making it pretty hard to get on target. It does do something pretty interesting to the harvesters though, in that the shots landed on it end up staggering it quite a bit, which can throw it off to the point where it doesn't even fire its laser. So I do like it for that, but it still will take a while to actually take these guys out. So you got to keep that in mind. While it's nice, it's really hard to recommend when the crossbow exists, especially with some of these downsides, but it's still a good option. I will give it an A for the squids. But next up is the SG-8P Punisher Plasma, which is a plasma launcher shooting these arced plasma explosions. And versus the squids, this is just plain awesome. The explosions can deal with a lot of the voteless horde at once, being able to kill quite a bit at the same time. And it also doesn't have the same issue of bouncing away like the crossbow does. It also hurts the overseers pretty well, also staggering them, which will keep them from fighting. This does struggle a little bit with the elevated overseers and with the watchers because of the arc pattern of your shots. It will take a little bit of work to get used to that. And while this isn't really good for taking out the harvesters, it can be used to stagger them, which is honestly a pretty useful thing in and of itself. Honestly, I think this feels very strong, and for me, this is going to get an S tier for the squids. But now we have the Arc 12 Blitzer, which is sort of a shotgun, but it dishes out electricity that staggers and arcs to multiple enemies. And this is actually freaking amazing versus the squids, giving them a little taste of their own electricity medicine. It can handle just so many at once, which it feels really nice, and it has infinite ammo, so you can just keep on firing. It does do a little bit of stun to the overseers, but not a ton. Either way though, it does deal with them pretty well, and can also deal with clumps of the voteless headed your way. You can even use this perpetually while just diving back and forth, and use this to stay alive for a while and just rack up the kills. It also does pretty well versus the watchers. And while it should be able to take out a harvester, I found that my arcs were only really doing damage some of the time and wasn't really often going where I wanted. Regardless, this is still amazing and well suited versus this faction, so I will be giving it an S tier. But now for the LAS-5 Scythe, which is a laser beam essentially that has infinite ammo and can set enemies on fire. And versus the squids, I'll say it's just okay. The beam will get the voteless horde nicely, taking them out pretty quickly with the fire damage helping you as well. And it can also take out the watchers relatively quickly. But versus the overseers, it does feel like it takes a while of continuously keeping your beam on them, and that can feel like a bit much. I do think this can be good for taking the elevated overseers, hitting their jetpacks, but often the jetpacks aren't as easily reachable, so I don't know if it's going to come in handy that much. For this, I'll give it a B for the squids. But let's move on to the LAS-16 Sickle, which is similar to the Scythe, only it releases these laser bullets more like an assault rifle. It does also have infinite ammo, which is definitely good. But unlike the Scythe, I feel like this is very, very solid versus the squids. This thing mows down the voteless horde very well, doing so with great accuracy, and having infinite ammo is also awesome. I haven't been a fan of this one versus the bugs because I feel like the delay in firing can be tough for enemies like the hunters and being able to respond quickly to bugs that sneak up on you. But I feel like versus the horde here, the voteless horde, they're a little bit more predictable, and so I don't find this little delay to really hurt you at all. This thing can also be good for taking the overseers out pretty decently, and I like the accuracy on this thing, which really helps versus the elevated overseers. Also, in general, as just being a very fast firing assault rifle, this will take shields down very quickly, and that's a definite plus. This is very solid, and so I will be giving an A for the squids. But now we have the Plas 1 Scorcher, and this is a full auto plasma shooter shooting these little explosions out. And this This one is interesting. Although I find this to typically be a pretty top tier weapon versus the bugs and the bots, I find it a little bit less so here, but it definitely is still very strong, especially versus the overseers and the watchers, which it takes out very quickly. And with the nice snappy aim, it can be easy to get on target. And I think that ends up being the greatest strength of this. This will mow down the horde pretty nicely as well, but it just runs out of the ammo very quickly, being a little bit less of an efficient weapon for doing this. This could be a great option to have with you if you want something dedicated for those medium guys, but you probably will need something like the machine gun or something with a little bit better ammo efficiency for the horde. The other thing here is that although this gun is usually something that can deal well with the more elite enemies, this seems like it can't really down a harvester from the joints. At least I couldn't seem to get any hit markers at all against this guy. It does take the shield down quickly though, so that's kind of nice. I do love this gun, and I think especially with its ability to take out the overseers quickly, it does have a good use here, but it's definitely not the strongest. I will give it an A for the squids. But now we have the Plas 101 Purifier, which is a dynamic version of the Scorcher that shoots these plasma projectiles in a fast semi-auto fashion or charged up for high damage staggering plasma explosions. And this really actually sits close to the Plasma Punisher in that you can actually use the charged up shots to stagger or splash damage multiple enemies at a time, but you also have the option to fast fire as a means to either thin the herd or take out overseers very quickly. The charged up shot is also pretty good at staggering the harvesters, and that's definitely a nice touch. For me, this is very strong. I think it's a little bit less strong than the Plasma Punisher just because the charged up shots fire at a slower rate, but it's very close. And so yeah, this is definitely an S tier for me. But let's move on to the Flam 66 Torture, and this is a primary version of the flamethrower that can deal fire damage to all enemies, including heavy enemies, but has a little bit less effectiveness than the stratagem version. And this is pretty good for the squids. It takes on the horde pretty well, and they will go down quickly, and you can light up the ground as well so that members of the horde that walk over it will get on fire. And especially when you're in the city streets, it's a little bit easier to make sure enemies go over these fire patches. This weapon will also deal well with the overseers, but you will need to get in close range for them. The watchers, it does feel like it takes a little long to take them out, and they're also a little bit of range, so it's not going to be the best for them, but it does okay. This thing can also take the harvesters out fairly well, but again, you will need to get very close where they will try to electrocute you. So if you are planning to take this and do this, I would recommend using the electrical conduit armor passive so that you can make it. This does feel very good to use, but yeah, you do have to get close, so it's not going to be the absolute best. I will give it an A for the squids. But now for the Jar 5 Dominator, which is a semi-auto firing gun where each bullet packs a ton of medium armor penetrating damage and stagger. And versus the squids, this is very good. Bullets actually will deal collateral to the voteless horde, so bullets end up actually piercing through them and can take multiple out at once, and that's definitely nice. So we'll also stagger and deal heavy damage to the overseers, so it can be a great option for them as well. This thing deals with the watchers pretty nicely too, but perhaps most impactful is how well this does versus the harvesters. The bullets on these things can take the shields down very quickly, and they can destroy the shield generators quickly, as well as getting at those joints and killing them pretty decently. The main issue I do have with this gun versus the Illuminate is the handling, which especially with the horde and the overseers can be a bit tricky as they kind of tend to zigzag around a little bit, so I found myself missing bullets quite a bit. The peak physique perk can be helpful with this though, giving you better handling on those weapons. While strong, I just didn't feel as in charge and dominating as I do with some of the other weapons on here, so I will be giving it an A for the squids. And so here we have our list. This is how the primary weapons fare versus the Illuminate. I think this will end up changing quite a bit when more Illuminate eventually arrive, but it's nice to see that Arrowhead has balanced this game to a point where most things feel pretty viable and usable. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and if you want to see how these guns fare versus the other two factions, you should check this video out. But otherwise, thank you to my YouTube members, and so long, Pooper Troopers.